staff his bureaucracy with men of equestrian status, not only to turn out the freedmen who had run the show previously and become experts at political graft, but also to command the loyalty of the equestrians, who had been marginalized by the wealth of the Senate on the one hand and the outsized influence of the freedmen on the other. The Antonine emperors continued to follow Domitian's precedent, favoring equestrians over freedmen when it came to staffing. But despite this political setback, freedmen as a whole could still expect to compete on an equal footing economically with the freeborn and establish comfortable lives for themselves. And, as I alluded earlier, a freedman's children were born free citizens, rendering any future prejudice moot. The economic activity that Romans and freedmen and provincials and slaves collectively engaged and competed in naturally varied from place to place, but it mostly divided into two main realms: city work and country work. To take the latter first, country work meant farming. By the 2nd century, the existence of the free-holding small farmer was largely a thing of the past, though, and peasants mostly wound up living as tenant farmers on large aristocratic estates. But of course, the massive influx of slave labor pushed many of the free families a problem we'll deal with in a second that would plague the empire until its final days. The farms of the classical world, like farms of today, were set to either produce the food that fed the empire or the cash crops that made it wealthy. The basic staple crops were wheat, millet, and barley, and together they formed the foundation of the grain and cereal-based Roman diet. The basic cash crops were olives and grapes, used mostly for oil and wine respectively. These latter two were not only sold domestically, but were also practically the only valuable exports the empire could muster to counteract the effects of what many considered a dangerously unbalanced trade deficit with the rest of the world. When we get into a more detailed description of the provinces, we'll refine a bit what came from where and why. So for now, I'm just going to leave it that though the political foundations of Rome was no longer the noble citizen farmer, the vast majority of families living in the empire were still engaged in agricultural work of some kind or another. Just like peasants of all ages, they lived within sight of where they had been born and died within sight of the plot of land they worked their whole lives. Visiting one of the empire's major urban centers, let alone Rome itself, was a ludicrous fantasy. But as ludicrous a thought as it was for most, the cities of the empire still teemed with the energy of millions. The various occupations of urban Romans were as varied as they were in any city today. Importers, wholesalers, retailers, bankers, cooks, innkeepers, masons, druggists, potters, tanners, jewelers, teachers, and actors all lived side by side and wheeled and dealed daily to get ahead, hedge against the future, jump at any opportunity, or make up for a loss. But of course, these gainfully employed citizens, ranging from the hand-to-mouth lower middle class to the relatively wealthy equestrian merchants, were far outnumbered by the mass of often unemployed wretches who lived on public assistance. The emperors tried to keep these poor masses quiet and peaceful with free grain and free games, which the poor gobbled up readily. But they also tried to provide honest work to keep them occupied, one of the major rationales behind the building explosions that transformed Rome between the reigns of Domitian and Hadrian. Despite the public assistance, life was hard at the bottom of the ladder. The grain dole, important as it was, couldn't sustain a poor family, as it was only calculated to feed free men, not their wives and children. The lower middle class didn't even receive this minimal subsidy, and were thus left to fend for themselves, their meager scrapings somehow making them too rich for public compassion. Even members of the better-off equestrian class often found themselves running a persistent household budget deficit just to stay afloat. These gaping financial holes had to be filled by someone, and so it was left to the patron, he of the ancient patron-client model of social kinship that had defined Roman society for centuries, to do the filling. That relationship had once been an overt quid pro quo of political support in exchange for favors and support in times of need, much like the machine politics of 19th century America. But following the collapse of the Republic, and with it the need for voters, it had evolved into a sort of second-track form of public assistance. Every morning, clients would come knocking at the door of their patrons. The patrons would welcome them in and turn over a few coins to honor the respect the clients paid them. In time, the once informal surprise gifts became formalized and expected, and the annual income of just about everyone in the city began to rely heavily on patronage. Clients were further able to cultivate more than one patron at a time, and the most active among them would bounce from house to house each morning, pocketing a few coins here and there until they had amassed a tidy sum that would keep them going for the rest of the day, until they woke up the next morning and repeated the ritual all over again. If this was considered poor form, it was only in passing, as everyone seemed to be doing everything they could to stay alive in an economic climate that was unpredictable and harsh even in the best of times. Besides, the only people who had any money were the super rich anyway, and so when they gave, you had to grab. Though wealth and class in Antonine Rome were not permanent states, and no one, not even slaves, couldn't at least hope for a better life, in practice, there was very little in the way of upward mobility. The rich had gotten massively richer, and they tended to keep their wealth in the family. Every generation a few clever merchants would rise, and a few bumbling heirs would fall. But for the most part, the rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and everyone else just kind of floated along in the middle, wondering how long they could avoid the poorhouse themselves. While the so-called five good emperors are to be commended for revising and extending the alimentary system and perpetuating the grain doles and stepping in to personally underwrite emergency relief when disaster struck, when you really think about it, they were actually downright miserly. They personally controlled something like half of the empire's GDP, and all they had for the poverty-stricken masses was an inadequate supply of grain, some construction jobs, and the promise that if their tenement building caught fire, that the emperor would cover their burial expenses. You don't have to be a fire-breathing Marxist to find problems with that, or to think twice about the moral underpinnings of a society that was quite content to live with a Gini coefficient approaching 1. Next week, though, we'll get into what all of these people did when they weren't simply trying to survive. How they educated their young, what they did for fun, how they worshipped their gods, and what gods, or god, they worshipped. This last bit is of critical importance, because the age of the Antonines was a transitional period, when the old state-sponsored polytheism of Jupiter and Juno and Minerva and Apollo were in decline, and the new Oriental mystery religions were on the rise. The old religions were lately seen as little more than a series of empty rituals, while the new Eastern religions promised adherents a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the universe and man's place within it. It was during these years that the cult of the Jewish carpenter really eventually lead to its envelopment of the entire Mediterranean world. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 87, Thinking and Feeling. Last time, we discussed the general economic and political ordering of Roman society in the age of the Antonines. Today, I want to add additional layers to that discussion by talking a bit about how these various classes felt about education, religion, and philosophy. Obviously, your outlook depended a great deal on your position in society, but as with most things, it was never quite that simple. Wealth and class usually locked Romans into inescapable social roles, but it did not necessarily predetermine their worldviews, what they held dear, what they believed, and to whom, if anyone, they prayed. One young senator reacted to his inherited wealth by turning towards Stoic self-denial, while his neighbor embraced the joyfully nihilistic leanings of the Epicureans. One middle-class merchant took the loss of his inventory to fire as proof that he needed to double down on his offerings to Jupiter, while his competitor took it to mean that the old gods had forsaken him, and that he must find a new religion to explain and justify his sorry lot in life. One dirt-poor pleb looked at the squalor in which he lived and decided to enlist in the army with the hope of rising through the ranks and maybe retiring to a comfortable farm someday, while his brother said bag it and went off to bet on the races. There were general outlooks that defined each class, but by no means did everyone march in lockstep with one another. Identity formation in ancient Rome often followed the same path it does today. At first, a child was locked into their family structure, with the attitudes and material possessions of their parents dominating their understanding of the world. But at a certain point, that child made contact with the outside world, free from the active mediation, translation, or protection of their parents. For most of us, as for many Roman children, that point of contact was primary school. Now, of course, the middle and upper classes were the only ones who could afford school for their children, as there was no universal free education as we know it today, so we're going to briefly leave behind the poor to learn what they can of the world on the streets of the city or in the fields of the country, and focus on the curriculum of the wealthier children. But do not fret for the poor boys and girls too much. Critics, both modern and ancient alike, cringe when they contemplate the damage wrought by the inadequate, boring, backwards, limited, and cruel years of primary education that were endured by the future leaders of the empire. Because the one major upshot of Roman early education was that it left its pupils intellectually incurious, distrustful of teachers, and generally glad to be rid of anything that reminded them of school, books, or learning in general. Not exactly the values of a ruling class with staying power. In the days of the Republic, things were different. One of the major responsibilities of a father, if not the overriding responsibility, was to handle the education of his children. In practice, this meant the boys and not really the girls, but that aside, it was very important for a father to develop and oversee the education of his offspring. Cato the Elder famously spent much of his time focused on the intellectual and physical growth of his sons and demanded that his colleagues do the same. But as the empire grew and enveloped the East, it became fashionable to turn over the children to educated Greek slaves for schooling. The father might consult with the teachers to develop lessons and monitor progress, but gradually, the whole process was outsourced to the tutors, and then, finally, to the group learning sessions we are all familiar with today. For those of you out there who are critical of how we handle early education in modern Western society, I can assure you that the horrors awaiting the Roman school children were 100 times worse. The class curriculum for children aged 7 to 12, in this case we are talking about both boys and girls who seem to have attended school together, was limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Students would use wax tablets to practice writing and an abacus for basic math. This seems well and good until you dig a little deeper. For starters, students were required to learn the names of the letters of the alphabet first, without any context for what they might mean to later word construction. They would repeat the names of the letters until they had memorized the proper order. This memorization went on before the teacher even showed them what the letters looked like, further exacerbating the mindless repetition of the process. Once the letters were named, the teacher would reveal what the letters looked like, and then command the student to copy the forms on their tablets. Without any initial instruction into how to hold or use their stylus, they were suddenly ordered to copy perfectly forms that they had never before seen. Mistakes in this or any other subject was met with corporal punishment, raps on the wrist for small mistakes, and full beatings for repeated failures. Arithmetic held no hope of relief, as